Hello and welcome back. Glad you're joining me again on my Media Monday. Today we're going to talk about the second concept of media literacy, which is that the media construct bracket versions of close bracket reality. I've left those brackets there partly because I've seen that both versions exist, but the way that I've come to understand them is that they are a little separate, and of course they also work together. So I'm going to explain it that way, kind of in two parts. Don't forget, last week we talked about how the media construct reality. Sorry, all media are constructions. And I said that often this one bleeds into, they bleed into each other. They certainly work together. So let's start about talking about the first part, which is that the media construct reality. So here's what the concept says. The media are responsible for the majority of the observations and experiences from which we build up our personal understandings of the world and how it works. If we think we know something, but we have no direct experience or personal knowledge of it, then the media, to a great extent, construct our reality. Which is true, right? I mean, if you think about it, we have lots of information coming at us. We think we know things. How do we know that they are true? I know that I've certainly had experiences where, talk about geography, a city that I've never been before, New York City. I have a pretty good idea in my head of what I think it's like. But I also know that probably if I was to ever go there, it would be quite different. We would do this in my class often where I would ask them to think of a city, like Paris, and they would throw out ideas of what Paris was like. And of course, when I asked them, well, how many of you have been there? Usually none of them, sometimes one or two, which was actually quite helpful. And then I'd ask the people who'd been there, okay, well, how does that compare? Is that the reality? And more often than not, people would say, no, it's not the reality. The things that we have been presented of the city of love and how beautiful it is, they would often say, the city kind of stinks, or it's not as pretty as you might think it is, or whatever it is. So, that's really the first idea, is that the media construct reality, that they have a sense of, they get ideas into our head. Okay. Even I had a recent conversation with a friend where he made the comment that our world is one of alternate realities. And it really hit me, because I think of that as Marvel movies and, we only see that in TV. But there seems to be a lot of truth to that. Because if you spend any time on social media, you'll see that people see this world very differently, right? At times I see people on the left saying that the right is heading, pushing us towards totalitarianism. And then, of course, I see the opposite too. People on the right saying the same thing about the left. And so, it's almost like they are living in different worlds. And again, I think the media plays a big role in that. One of the ideas that I would talk about a lot too is that, and I'm not sure I have the wording right, but it certainly makes sense to me, there's nothing in the media that is real, right? The word real doesn't really apply to media. Yes, they are covering real things, but once it becomes mediated, right, once they actually start to create something, it's not real anymore. It's pre-constructed. Okay? And one of the next idea that goes along with that, the media construct versions of reality, is that all of these media that are pre-constructed, like we talked about with the first concept, they have attitudes, interpretations, and conclusions already built in, right? So everything has some sort of, sometimes the word bias comes up, but they have attitudes built into them, okay? And I'll explain a little bit more of that later. I used to talk too about how this is probably the concept that Donald Trump is talking about when he refers to things as being fake news, right? What he really means is that the news, probably, I can't speak for him, and I don't. There's another example, right? I have a sense of who Donald Trump is. All comes through the media. Never met the man, never talked to him, never been in the same state area as far as I know. So I will admit that my version of him is constructed by the media. But what I get the sense that he really means when he talks about fake news is that the news that portrays him poorly is biased. And he's probably right. It is. Because all news is biased to some degree, right? We often use these words subjective, objective when it comes to news. We want our news to be objective as possible, and the best news, the best journalism is. But the truth is that simply even selecting what to cover shows bias, right? We can't cover everything. We can cover a lot now, of course, with internet news, but we can't cover everything. And even in the internet news, depending on where you place it. In the old days, it was in the newspaper. The most important story goes on the front, right? Least important story goes at the back. all of those things are also subjective decisions. So I think that's what Trump means when he talks about fake news. The problem is that he doesn't acknowledge that the stuff that portrays him positively is also fake news, right? It's also biased. So one of the ways that I used to demonstrate this is, for me, how I came to understand it. And there were two really big examples for me. And I'm going to try to put links in the little description down below. So if you want to look at these yourself, you can. See, it's evolving, right? I said it would evolve, so I'm getting a little better, a little smarter about it, hopefully. And the first one has to do with this famous Prince William photo, or photos, I guess. And what had happened was Prince William had had his third child. He was coming out of the hospital. Of course, there were probably hundreds of photographers taking photos, and two of them just happened to get these photos at the same time. And one of them, it's more from straight on, if you looked at it, you could see that Prince William was doing this. Clearly he had been asked something about, how's your son doing? And he said, my third child, whatever it was. However, there was a slightly different angle where it looked like he was giving the finger to everybody. So even in that case, right, exact same moment, two different photos, two very different impressions, two very different attitudes built into those. One of them, he's just being a friendly guy talking to the press. The other one, he's giving them the finger, right? And he's angry. Okay. And again, it seems like an obvious example, and it is in some ways, but I always found it was good to start with the big stuff, right? And talk about, here are some big examples of what I'm talking about. The other one that was big for me was, as I talked about earlier, the places, right? Geography. And I did this thing once where I started looking for alternate photos of kind of some very famous places. And I found this whole list. And again, I'll put a link in the description below. But for me, it was the pyramids, right? Because the version of reality that was constructed in my mind was that the pyramids were off in the desert somewhere, that you'd have to get on a camel and you'd have to travel for 3 days to get to them. And suddenly, you'd come up over the sand dune and you'd see them and wow, there they are. And all it took was one photo taken from the opposite side. Most of the photos are all taken with the kind of the desert in the background. But you swing around the other side and suddenly you see, oh my God, the pyramids are right on the edge of a city. I think if you look closely at the photo, you can see a golf course that's just a few hundred feet away. Like, it's literally right there. You don't even have to leave the city to get to them. That was a big moment for me, where I realized this concept and the role that it plays in my life, right? There are other ones there that might be better for you. So we would talk about those big things, and then I would often show them the spaghetti story. And if you haven't seen the spaghetti story, again, I'll put the link below. Watch it now. Pause this, watch it now. And then when you come back, as you are right now, I'll tell you that I would show it to my class. I would just simply say, just watch this 3-minute documentary and we'll talk about it afterwards. And as you probably just saw, it's about how spaghetti is grown on trees. And when the video is over, there's usually, a little bit of uncomfortable laughter and snickering. And I would ask the class, okay, how many of you believe that that's how spaghetti is produced? There was usually at least one that kind of, their hand went up a little bit. They were a little sheepish about it. But they would, some of them would admit it. Yep, I thought that. And then I would say, okay, well, the rest of you know how spaghetti is made, clearly. But how many of you at least questioned that? How many of you started thinking, do I really know how spaghetti is made? And it was amazing that the number of students who would say, yeah, it did make me at least question that, right? And then we talk about, well, why is that? And if you haven't watched the video, again, it's very well done, right? We would talk about things, how it's black and white, which makes it seem like old and archival. It's even got scratches, I think, put on it. There's actual footage of the trees with spaghetti growing on it, right? There are experts that they talk to. They give details like the spaghetti weevil, right? These things that they make up. And all of those things make it seem believable. Oh, there's also a narrator, what's called a voice of God narrator, right? And even that, you can probably guess, gives it some authority. And all that means is you don't see the narrator, right? You just hear the voice. And when that was over, I would say to them, okay, fair enough. You can see that this is fake. But what if this was about something that you had no previous knowledge of, right? What if this was about a subject that you were just being taught about for the first time? Would you believe it? And of course they would, right? They would be, yeah, this is the truth. And so I really tried to emphasize that point, right? Yeah, that's funny. We can recognize that this is done as a bit of a parody, trying to challenge us. But if it was about something that we didn't know, we would believe it. And, it makes me think of this too. We've kind of entered a new stage when it comes to parody, because I had this experience where somebody had shared a link to a story from Australia. And I don't remember exactly what it was, but the photo, I think, was two police officers and a new sign that was talking about how if you're going to jog here, you have to wear a helmet, right? And it was really making fun of the nanny state and how government's trying to control our lives. And a quick Google search, I discovered very quickly that this was a site like The Onion, a parody site where they're just making fun of things, not real. And I pointed this out to some people. So I went back to the original post and I said, you do realize that this is parody, that it's not real. And I was amazed by the reaction that I got, because a lot of people spoke up and said, but it could happen, right? Doesn't matter if it's happened or not, it could happen. And so therefore they're treating it as it's real, right? This is where we are now. Well, we're not. And of course, the more that they share that, the more that becomes part of that narrative, right? And it also brings up something else that I wanted to mention too, that recently I was in at least 2 or 3 conversations about the idea of censorship. And a lot of people kept saying, well, we have censorship in Canada. And I had to say to them, I don't think so. I mean, I think they're talking about Facebook and how they're not able to share news. That's a private company. They can do that. That's not censorship. Censorship to me is when you can't get access to something. You are not allowed to access it, right? So I used to give an example in my class of the famous tank man in Tiananmen Square. And again, I'll put a link down below if you've never seen the photo. If you Google it here, you're going to get page after page after page of that photo. But if you're in China and you Google that same photo, it doesn't exist. Because the Chinese government made a deal with Google and other search engines that if you want to be in our country, you have to not show things that we say not to show. And that's one of them. They don't acknowledge that Tiananmen Square ever happened. It's not part of their history, right? It's been censored. So that's a little bit different than what we're talking about here. Here we're talking about a version of reality. We've probably all had those experiences where we've been somewhere that's gotten some press coverage. We've maybe seen an accident, witnessed it. Maybe we've been at a concert or a festival. We've gone home and we've turned the news on or opened the newspaper the next day and we've read the story about it, and it's different than what we experienced, right? Well, that's, that happens. That's the version of reality that's being created. And then, of course, we have to start, and we'll get into this in later concepts. Well, what guides those decisions? Why do they choose to focus on this rather than this, right? And there are reasons for it, and we will get there. And it even happens on a personal level, too. I have to tell you another kind of interesting story. In the early days of cell phones, before everybody had a smartphone, I was at a local concert hall, and there were 3 younger people there that I noticed. I'm quite a people watcher, right? I'm a photographer, so remember that. And they were all on their phones, and they really, they were staring at them. They didn't seem to be having a very good time. And then suddenly I watched as one held their phone up, right? You could tell they were getting ready to take a video or a photo. I assume it was a video. And immediately the other 2 people, their heads popped up, their phones went away, and then they were laughing and smiling and dancing and having a good time. And then clearly the person filming stopped filming, and they went back to what they were doing, right? So they were also constructing a version of reality, a personal version of reality to share on their social media. Oh, look at us, we're having a great time. But if you were there in person, you would have seen that, well, that wasn't really what was happening. It didn't appear to me at least like they were having a good time. And as I talked about this idea in my class about real, and things not being real, I would use the word reality, things are realistic, but not real. And they would say, well, what about actual events? The news, they cover actual events. They have live footage or photos. Photos don't lie. And I would say, well, it's not again that they lie necessarily, but they are versions of reality, right? As a photographer, I know that I make decisions that impact the meaning of my photo. It could be the lens that I choose. It could be the angle that I choose. It could be who I focus on, who I put in the frame, who I leave out of the frame, the look on their faces, right? I've done lots of concert photography, and I can find a photo that would make someone look good, and I can find a photo that makes someone look bad, right? I used to even say to the class, think about this. I could bring in a camera, 2 cameras into my classroom, and I could film, put one at the back of the room and one at the front. The back one filming me, the one at the front filming the students. I could go home that night with that footage, and I could come back in the next day with 2 very different versions of reality of my classroom. One of them would have me, sitting at my desk, not talking to my students. It would cut to the students, one combing their hair, one asleep, one talking, one throwing a paper airplane, and I looked like the worst teacher in the world. Or I could choose the moments where I'm engaging, I'm talking, I look like I'm having a good time, and I could intercut that with shots of students who are looking, interested, with their hands up, excited, saying lots of great things. And suddenly I'm the best teacher there is. And the reality is that neither one of them are true, right? Neither one of them are real. They are versions of reality that have been created, all right? And, I think I already mentioned the idea of subjective and objective, right? I'm not convinced it's possible to be completely objective, as I said. I would even tell my students, your textbooks are versions of reality, right? When you're learning your history, somebody has decided that these are the events that we should cover. I'm sure my colleagues love this, but it was true, and we should consider that in everything that we read, right? So I'll leave you with this. This is another line I heard somewhere. Actually, I think I saw it on a piece of graffiti on a side of a wall in downtown Owen Sound. It said, "The media is the flashlight in the darkened room." And again, I think that illustrates this concept really nicely, is that they are picking and choosing what to show, which means that it's a version of reality. It's not real. Thanks for watching. As always, it'd be great if you could subscribe to this channel, if you could share it. If you want to see more of what I'm doing, you can go to goodnoise.ca there. You can also find me on Facebook, Instagram. I don't use Twitter a lot, but I am there. And anything that you can do to kind of get this out there is much appreciated. So thanks. We'll see you next week.